The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December, delivered to Captain Ibrahim Traoré's office at the military headquarters in Ouagadougou. It was an unremarkable envelope, slightly yellowed with age, addressed in careful handwriting that spoke of an older generation's education. The return address listed a village called Bondokui, a place Traoré knew well, for it was where he had been born. Traoré sat at his desk, the morning sun streaming through the window, casting long shadows across the papers scattered before him. He had been reviewing security reports from the northern regions, where the insurgency continued to challenge his government's authority. But something about this envelope made him pause, made him set aside the urgent matters of state for just a moment. He opened it carefully, extracting a single sheet of paper covered in that same deliberate handwriting. The letter began without preamble. "Captain Traoré, you do not know me, but I know you. My name is Adama Ouedraogo, and I was a friend of your uncle, Moussa Traoré, who died in 1989. Before I leave this world, for I am old now and my time is short, I must tell you something about your family that has been kept hidden for far too long. There is a house in Bondokui, on the eastern edge of the village, near the old baobab tree. It belonged to your uncle. No one has entered it in more than 30 years. Inside, you will find answers to questions you never knew to ask. But I warn you, some truths are heavy burdens to carry. Come soon if you wish to know. I will be waiting at my compound near the mosque. Ask anyone in the village for old Adama. They all know me." Traoré read the letter 3 times, his mind racing with questions. He had never heard of an uncle named Moussa. His father had rarely spoken of his family's history, always changing the subject when young Ibrahim had asked about his relatives, about the family tree, about who came before. It was as if there was a wall in his father's memory, a place beyond which he refused to go. He called in his aide, Lieutenant Sawadago, a trusted officer who had served with him through many difficult operations. "I need to make a trip to Bondokui," Traoré said, folding the letter carefully. "Personal business. I'll be gone for 2 days, maybe 3. Sawadago looked concerned. "Sir, with respect, is it wise to leave the capital right now? The security situation will wait," Traoré interrupted, but not unkindly. "Sometimes, Lieutenant, there are matters that cannot be postponed. This is one of them." That evening, Traoré made the call he had been dreading. His father, Joseph Traoré, still lived in a modest house in Ouagadougou, retired now from his work as a civil servant. The phone rang 4 times before the old man answered. "Father, it's Ibrahim. I need to ask you something." Traoré paused, choosing his words carefully. "Did you have a brother named Moussa?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Traoré thought the connection had been lost. Then, finally, his father's voice came through, low and strained. "Where did you hear that name?" "I received a letter from someone in Bondokui. They say there's a house." "No." His father's voice was sharp, almost panicked. "Ibrahim, listen to me. Leave this alone. That name, that house, they are from a time we do not speak of. There are some doors that should remain closed. But father, if I have family I never knew about, if there's history I should understand." "You understand enough." Joseph Traoré rarely raised his voice, but now it cracked with emotion. "Your uncle Moussa died a long time ago. There is nothing in that house but pain and old ghosts. I'm telling you as your father, stay away from there." The line went dead. Traoré sat in his office, staring at the phone, feeling the weight of his father's fear. It was that fear, more than curiosity, that convinced him he had to go to Bondokui. Whatever was in that house, whatever truth had been buried there, it had the power to terrify a man decades after the fact. And Traoré, who had spent his military career confronting difficult truths, could not turn away from this one. The next morning, he left Ouagadougou before dawn, driving his personal vehicle rather than using official transport. This journey felt private, intimate in a way that military formality would have ruined. The road to Bondokui stretched westward through the Sahelian landscape, past fields where farmers were already at work despite the early hour, past small villages where children waved at passing vehicles, past the vast expanse of scrubland that characterized this part of Burkina Faso. He had not been back to Bondokui in nearly 2 years. His childhood memories of the village were warm, running through the dusty streets with other children, learning to ride a bicycle on the uneven paths, sitting with his grandmother under the shade of trees while she told stories of the old days. But those memories felt distant now, almost as if they belonged to a different person. As he drove, Traoré found his mind drifting to what little he knew of Burkina Faso's recent history. He had been born in 1988, just a year after Thomas Sankara's assassination and Blaise Compaoré's rise to power. His childhood and adolescence had been spent under Compaoré's regime, 27 years of what many called stability, but which others whispered was built on fear and silence. He had joined the military in 2009, during the final years of that regime, and had witnessed firsthand the corruption and dysfunction that led to Compaoré's fall in 2014. But there were gaps in the history, periods that people didn't talk about. The late 1980s and early 1990s were particularly murky, a time when Sankara's supporters had simply vanished from public life, when certain families had fallen into poverty overnight, when questions about disappeared relatives were met with nervous silence. Could his uncle Musa have been part of that purge? Had his father's refusal to speak about that time been born not of forgetfulness, but of survival? Traoré reached Bondokui around mid-morning. The village had grown since his childhood, sprawling outward from its traditional center, but the core remained unchanged. Mud brick compounds with corrugated metal roofs, narrow paths winding between family homes, the central mosque with its distinctive tower, the market area where women sold vegetables and spices. He parked near the mosque and asked a passing elder about Adama Ouedraogo. The old man's face brightened. "Ah, you seek Papa Adama?" Yes, his compound is just there, past the school. Everyone knows Papa Adama. He is one of our wisest elders, though his health is not good these days." Traoré found the compound easily, a traditional Burkinabe home with a courtyard surrounded by several small buildings. An ancient man sat in the shade of a mango tree, his weathered face bearing the marks of 8 or 9 decades of life. Despite his obvious frailty, his eyes were sharp and clear. "Captain Traoré," the old man said, not as a question, but as a statement of recognition, "you have your uncle's bearing. The same straight back, the same way of looking at the world as if you can fix it through will alone." He gestured to a wooden stool beside him. "Sit. We have much to discuss, and I have not long to discuss it." Traoré sat, feeling the weight of the moment. "You knew my uncle well." "Musa was like a son to me," Adama said, his voice carrying the sadness of old grief. "We taught together at the village school in the 1980s. Brilliant man, your uncle. Believed in Sankara's revolution with all his heart. Believed that Burkina Faso could truly become the land of upright people that the name promised." He paused, his gaze distant. That belief cost him everything. "What happened to him?" Traoré asked quietly. Adama sighed. "That, my son, you will understand better when you see his house. But know this. Your uncle was not the only one who disappeared after 1987. There were many. Teachers, civil servants, students, anyone who had been too vocal in their support of Sankara's ideals. The new regime wanted silence, and those who would not be silent were made to disappear." He pulled a key from his pocket, old and rusted but still functional. "This is the key to Musa's house. I have kept it all these years, waiting for the right time to give it to someone in your family. Your father, I knew, would never come for it. The fear runs too deep in him. But you are different. You have already shown you are not afraid to confront difficult truths." He pressed the key into Traoré's palm. "The house is on the eastern edge of the village. You cannot miss it. It is the only one with a blue door that has been locked for decades. Go there. See what your uncle left behind. Then, if you wish, come back and we will talk more." Traoré stood, clutching the key. "Thank you, Papa Adama. I promise I will honor my uncle's memory." The old man nodded. "That is all any of us can do for the dead. Honor their memory, and make sure their stories are not forgotten." As Traoré walked back through the village toward the eastern edge, he felt as though he were walking through time itself, stepping backward into a history that had been deliberately erased. The blue door, when he finally found it, stood out like a wound against the weathered wall of the compound. Weeds had grown up around the entrance, and the courtyard beyond looked wild and abandoned. He inserted the key into the lock. It resisted at first, rust and time making it stubborn, but finally it turned with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet morning. The door swung open, and Traoré stepped across the threshold into his family's hidden past. Darom. Chapter 2. The Abandoned House. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the darkened interior through cracks in the shuttered windows. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the musty smell of decades of abandonment. Traoré stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, feeling as though he had stepped into a tomb, not of a person, but of a life interrupted. The main room was simple but had once been carefully maintained. A wooden table sat in the center, 4 chairs tucked neatly beneath it, as if waiting for a family meal that would never come. Against one wall stood a bookshelf, sagging slightly but still holding its burden of volumes, whose spines were illegible beneath layers of dust. A few faded photographs hung on the walls, their subjects obscured by grime and the passage of time. Traoré moved deeper into the house, his footsteps leaving prints in the dust that covered the floor like a shroud. There were 3 other rooms, a bedroom with a simple bed frame and a wardrobe, a smaller room that appeared to have been a study, and a tiny kitchen area with a charcoal stove and a few pots still sitting on a shelf. Everything was frozen in time, as if the occupant had simply walked out one day and never returned. Which, Traoré realized with a chill, was probably exactly what had happened. He went to the study first, drawn by what looked like papers stacked on a small desk. The desk itself was handmade, the kind of simple but solid furniture that spoke of practicality and care. Traoré pulled back one of the shutters, letting more light flood the room, and sat down in the chair before the desk. The papers on top were covered in his uncle's handwriting. He knew it must be his uncle's day, for it matched the careful script of the letter Adama had sent him. They appeared to be lesson plans for teaching history and civics. One page outlined a discussion about the importance of literacy, quoting Thomas Sankara's speeches about how education could liberate people from oppression. Traoré felt a pang of connection to this man he had never met. He too believed in education, in the power of knowledge to transform lives. It was one of the reasons he had joined the military, not just to fight, but to protect the civilians who were trying to build better futures for themselves and their children. Beneath the lesson plans were notebooks, journals filled with his uncle's thoughts and observations. Traoré picked up one dated 1985 and began to read. Today we discussed women's rights in class. The children, especially the boys, struggled with the concept that women should have equal access to education and positions of authority. This is the weight of tradition, the chains of the old ways, but I see hope in their questions. They are thinking, challenging what they have been told. This is what Sankara's revolution is about, not just changing laws on cases, but changing minds. Another entry from 1986. There is growing tension in the village. Some of the elders are unhappy with the committees for the defense of the revolution. They say the CDRs have too much power, that they are making decisions that should be left to traditional authorities. I understand their concern, but I also see how the CDRs are giving voice to people who have never had power before. Women, young people, the poor. Change is never comfortable for those who benefited from the old system. Traoré read entry after entry, piecing together a picture of his uncle as an idealistic teacher who had thrown himself into Sankara's revolutionary project with complete dedication. Moussa Traoré had believed passionately in the transformation of Burkina Faso, in the idea that a small, poor African nation could break free from French neocolonialism, could lift its people out of poverty through collective action and national pride. But as Traoré continued reading, he began to see darker undertones emerging in the journals. An entry from mid-1987, "The atmosphere has changed. There are whispers of divisions within the CNR. Some say Compaoré and Sankara are no longer in agreement. I don't know what to believe. All I know is that people are afraid in a way they were not before. Even committed revolutionaries are starting to watch their words, to look over their shoulders." And then, dated October 10th, 1987, just 5 days before Sankara's assassination, "Something is coming. I can feel it in the way people avoid certain topics, in the way meetings end abruptly when I enter. Joseph came to see me today. My brother was agitated, begged me to stop writing these journals, to stop being so vocal in my support of Sankara. He said there are forces moving that I don't understand, that my idealism will get me killed. I tried to tell him that silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of complicity, but he just looked at me with such fear in his eyes. I have never seen my brother afraid before." Traoré's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. The next entry was dated October 16th, 1987, the day after Sankara's death. "Thomas Sankara is dead. shot yesterday during what they're calling a coup led by Traoré. The official story is confused, contradictory. Some say it was necessary to save the revolution. Others whisper of betrayal and murder. I don't know what to think. I only know that everything we worked for hangs in the balance. What will become of the reforms? What will become of those of us who believed so completely in what Sankara represented? Joseph came again today, more insistent. He wants me to burn these journals, to destroy any evidence of my political activities. He says Traoré's people are making lists, identifying Sankara's strongest supporters. I told him I have nothing to hide. I was a teacher, an educator. I committed no crimes. But Joseph just shook his head. Brother, he said, in times like these, belief itself is a crime. There were several more entries over the following weeks, each one growing more apprehensive. Musa wrote about teachers being dismissed from their positions, about students being questioned about what their instructors had taught them about Sankara, about neighbors who suddenly stopped talking to families suspected of Sankarist sympathies. The final entry was dated November 28, 1987. They came to the school today, men from the new government, asking questions about what I had taught, what I had said about Traoré, what I thought about the direction of the country. I answered honestly, perhaps too honestly. I said I mourned Sankara, that I thought his assassination was a tragedy for Burkina Faso. I could see in their eyes that this was the wrong answer. When I came home this evening, Joseph was waiting for me. He was crying. I have not seen my brother cry since we were children. He begged me to leave and to go to Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana, anywhere but here. But where would I go? This is my home. These are my people. I will not run from my own country. If believing in justice, in equality, in the dignity of all people makes me a criminal in this new Burkina Faso, then I will face whatever consequences come. But I will not recant. I will not pretend I did not believe in something beautiful, even if that beautiful thing has now been destroyed. That was the last entry. The rest of the journal's pages were blank. Traoré sat in the silent house, feeling the weight of his uncle's words settling over him like a heavy cloak. He understood now why his father had never spoken of Musa, why the fear in Joseph Traoré's voice had been so palpable when Ibrahim had mentioned his uncle's name. His father had watched his brother disappear, had known that speaking about him could bring the same fate upon his own family. He stood and moved to the bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines. The titles told the story of an educated, politically engaged mind. Works by Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba. Books about Pan-Africanism, decolonization, revolutionary theory. Any one of these volumes would have been enough to mark someone as politically suspect in the years following Sankara's death. On the top shelf, pushed back against the wall, Traoré found a small wooden box. He lifted it down carefully, feeling its weight, and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photographs. The first showed a young man in his 20s, standing in front of a school building, surrounded by smiling children. The man had Traoré's own eyes, the same strong jawline, the same serious expression tempered by a hint of warmth. This was Musa, his uncle, frozen in a moment of simple happiness. Other photographs showed Musa at what appeared to be political gatherings. Young people holding banners with Sankara's image, crowds celebrating in the streets of Ouagadougou, meetings of what must have been the committees for the defense of the revolution. In several photos, Musa stood beside other young men and women, all of them looking at the camera with that particular expression of idealistic youth, the belief that they could change the world. At the bottom of the box was a letter, sealed in an envelope addressed to my family, if I do not return. Traoré's heart hammered in his chest as he opened it with shaking hands. The letter was dated December 1st, 1987, just 3 days after the final journal entry. To my beloved family, if you are reading this, it means I have been taken and I have not come back. I want you to know that I do not regret my choices. I believed in something larger than myself, larger than any individual. I believed in the possibility of a just and equitable society, in the idea that Burkina Faso could be a beacon of hope for all of Africa. Thomas Sankara showed us what was possible. In just 4 years, he proved that a leader could serve the people rather than enriching himself, that development was possible without selling our sovereignty to foreign powers, that the poor and marginalized could have voices in their own governance. Yes, there were mistakes. Yes, the revolution was imperfect, but it was ours, and it was beautiful in its ambition. I know that speaking these truths has made me a target. I know that in this new era, my beliefs are dangerous, but I cannot remain silent. To do so would be to betray everything I have taught, everything I have stood for. To my brother Joseph, I know you tried to save me, tried to make me see reason. Forgive me for being too stubborn to listen. Protect your family. Keep them safe in ways I could not keep myself safe. But do not let them forget that once, briefly, we dreamed of something better. To my future nieces and nephews, whom I will likely never meet, know that your uncle believed in you, in your generation, in the possibility that you would inherit a country worth living in. Do not be afraid to question, to challenge, to imagine a better world. The powerful will always prefer your silence, but silence is death to the spirit. I'm not afraid of what comes next. I have lived according to my principles, and that is more than many can say. Whatever happens to me, remember that ideas cannot be killed. They may be suppressed for a time, buried and hidden, but they endure in the hearts of those who believe. With all my love, Moussa Traoré found tears streaming down his face, though he barely noticed them. This man, this brave, foolish, principled man, had been his uncle, had been erased from family history not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had believed in something dangerous: justice. He carefully returned the letter to the box and continued his exploration of the house. In the bedroom, he found more evidence of a life interrupted. Clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, simple and well-worn. A pair of shoes by the door. A book on the nightstand, a bookmark still in place. It was the bookmark that finally broke him. Such a small thing, a strip of paper marking a place where his uncle had stopped reading, intending to return, never knowing that he would never get the chance. Traoré sat on the edge of the bed and let himself grieve for the uncle he had never known, for the family history that had been stolen from him, for all the people who had been disappeared during those dark years. After a long while, he composed himself and returned to the study. There had to be more here, more pieces of the puzzle. What exactly had happened to Moussa after that final letter? Had he been arrested? Killed? Had he simply vanished into the countryside, hoping to hide from the authorities? He searched systematically through the desk drawers, through boxes stacked in the corners, through every nook and space in the house. And finally, tucked behind a loose board in the wall of the study, he found a folder wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and time. Inside were documents that made his blood run cold. Lists of names, dates, locations. They appeared to be records of arrests and detentions from late 1987 and early 1988. Some names were crossed out with a single red line. Others had notations next to them: transferred, released, deceased. Moussa Traoré's name was on one of these lists, dated December 3, 1987. Next to it was written, "Detention Facility, Ouagadougou. Political education required." Political education. Traoré knew what that euphemism had meant during the early years of Compaoré's regime. It was a polite term for imprisonment, interrogation, and often worse. But his uncle's name did not have the dreaded red line through it, nor was it marked deceased. Instead, it simply trailed off at the edge of the page, as if the record-keeper had run out of space or interest in tracking what happened to one more inconvenient idealist. Traoré sat back, his mind racing. His uncle had been arrested. That much was clear. But what had happened after? Had he died in detention? Been released and forced to flee the country? Or had he met some other fate, one that his family had been too terrified to discover? He needed to know, not just for himself, but for his uncle's memory, for the truth that had been buried for so long. Moussa Traoré's story deserved to be told. His disappearance deserved to be investigated, and the silence that had shrouded his fate for decades deserved to be broken. As Traoré gathered the journals, photographs, and documents to take with him, he made a decision. He would uncover what happened to his uncle. He would use every resource at his disposal as a military leader, every connection he had built, every ounce of influence he possessed. The time for silence, for fear, for accepting the official stories without question, that time was over. Burkina Faso had changed. Compaoré was gone, overthrown by the same popular outrage that had finally brought justice to Sankara's memory. The trial for Sankara's assassination had concluded just a few years ago, with Compaoré found guilty. If justice could be pursued for the murdered president, then surely it could be pursued for all the nameless others who had disappeared in the purge that followed. As he locked the blue door behind him and walked back through Bondokui toward Adama Ouedraogo's compound, Traoré felt something shift inside him. He had come to this village seeking answers about his family. He was leaving with a mission that went far beyond personal curiosity. His uncle's story was not unique. There were thousands like him, teachers, civil servants, students, activists, who had vanished during those years. Their families still lived with the uncertainty, with the fear of asking questions, with the unhealed wounds of loss without closure. But now, things could be different. Now, someone with power and position was willing to ask those questions, to dig into those old wounds, to demand accountability for what had been done in the name of political stability. Papa Adama was waiting for him in the same spot under the mango tree, as if he had not moved in the hours since Traoré had left. "You have seen?" the old man asked. "I have seen," Traoré replied, sitting down beside him. "And now I need to know everything you can tell me about what happened after my uncle was arrested." Adama nodded slowly. "Then we have much to discuss, Captain. Much to discuss indeed." Epilogue. The sun hung low over Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the newly unveiled monument in the city's renovated Place de la Nation. It had been 18 months since that December morning when he first pushed open the blue door in Bondokui. 18 months since he began a journey that would transform not just his understanding of his family, but the entire nation's relationship with its buried past. The monument was simple but powerful, a series of bronze plaques arranged in a circle, each bearing the names of those who had disappeared in the years following Sankara's assassination. There were 1,247 names in total, painstakingly compiled through months of investigation, interviews, and archival research. Among them, in the fourth row of the eastern plaque, was inscribed Moussa Traoré, teacher, 1952-1988. He believed in justice. Traoré ran his fingers over his uncle's name, feeling the raised bronze letters beneath his touch. The date of death, 1988, had been determined through the testimony of a former prison guard who had finally come forward after decades of silence. The old man, now in his 70s and dying of cancer, had wanted to clear his conscience before facing whatever judgment awaited him in the afterlife. "Your uncle was a good man," the guard had told Traoré during one of their interviews, his voice weak but clear. "He never stopped teaching, even in that terrible place. He would gather the other prisoners and hold lessons about history, about philosophy, about why dignity mattered even when everything had been taken from you. The authorities hated it, but they couldn't quite break him." The guard had described how Moussa had died, not from torture or execution, but from dysentery and malnutrition, common killers in the overcrowded detention facilities of that era. He had been sick for weeks, denied proper medical care, and had finally succumbed in a cell he shared with 12 other political prisoners. They had buried him in an unmarked grave in a cemetery on the outskirts of the city, a place that had since been built over with new construction. Traoré had stood at that construction site, watching bulldozers move earth, knowing his uncle's bones were somewhere beneath the concrete and steel of modern Ouagadougou. They would never be recovered, never be given a proper burial, but at least now his uncle's name was spoken aloud. At least now his story was known. The investigation that began with one man's curiosity about his family had grown into something far larger. Working with human rights organizations, journalists, and a dedicated team of researchers, Traoré had helped establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for post-1987 disappearances. The commission had spent the past year collecting testimonies, examining old records, and piecing together the systematic campaign of repression that had followed Compaoré's coup. What they had discovered was both horrifying and illuminating. In the 18 months following Sankara's death, an estimated 1,500 people had been detained for political reasons. Of those, at least 1,200 had been subjected to what the regime euphemistically called political re-education, a process that involved imprisonment, forced labor, interrogation, and in many cases, torture. Approximately 300 had died in custody, their deaths recorded as accidents, illnesses, or simply not recorded at all. The majority of those targeted had been teachers, civil servants, and students, people whose crime was having believed too passionately in Sankara's vision, having spoken too loudly about justice and equality, having organized communities through the now-dissolved Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. They had been seen as threats not because they had done anything violent, but because they represented ideas that the new regime found dangerous. "Captain Traoré," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see an elderly woman approaching, supported by a younger woman who appeared to be her daughter. The older woman's face was deeply lined, marked by decades of grief, but her eyes held a fierce light. "Yes, grandmother," Traoré said respectfully, using the traditional term of respect for an elder. "I am Aminata Kabore," the woman said, her voice surprisingly strong. "My husband's name is on that monument, Basile Kabore. He was an agronomist, worked with the forestry program, planting trees to fight desertification. They took him in 1988 because he refused to denounce Sankara's environmental policies." Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. "For 37 years, I did not know what happened to him. I raised our 4 children alone, never knowing if he was dead or alive, never allowed to ask questions without risking our own safety." She reached out and grasped Traoré's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for giving me the truth. Thank you for letting me finally mourn properly. Thank you for making sure my grandchildren know their grandfather was not a criminal. He was a hero." Traoré felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your husband was a hero, grandmother. They all were. Every name on these plaques represents someone who refused to compromise their principles, who stood for something larger than themselves." The woman nodded, tears now streaming freely down her face. "Will there be justice? Will those responsible be held accountable?" This was the question Traoré heard most often these days, and it was the one he struggled most to answer honestly. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had succeeded in documenting the abuses, in giving voice to the victims and their families, but prosecution was another matter entirely. "We are working toward justice," he said carefully, "but you must understand, many of those responsible are dead in exile or protected by complex political considerations. What we can promise is truth. We can promise that these stories will not be forgotten, that the suffering of your husband and all the others will be recognized and honored." The woman studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Truth is better than silence. Memory is better than erasure. Perhaps that is enough." She squeezed his hand once more, then allowed her daughter to lead her away toward the monument, where she stood for a long time before her husband's name, speaking words only she could hear. Traoré watched her go, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with this work. The commission had opened old wounds, had forced a nation to confront uncomfortable truths about its recent past. Not everyone was happy about it. He had received threats, faced opposition from those who believed the past should remain buried, who argued that reconciliation required forgetting rather than remembering. Just last week, there had been a contentious cabinet meeting where several ministers had questioned the wisdom of continuing the commission's work. "We need to focus on the present," one had argued, "on the insurgency, on economic development, on the challenges we face today. Why dredge up old conflicts that will only divide us?" Traoré had responded with passion, citing his uncle's story as evidence of why this work mattered. "We cannot build a just future on a foundation of lies and silence," he had said. "These disappeared persons were our parents, our uncles and aunts, our teachers and neighbors. They were part of the fabric of our society, and their loss diminished us all. If we want to create a Burkina Faso worthy of Sankara's vision, a true land of upright people, then we must start by being upright about our own history." His words had carried the day, at least for now. The commission would continue its work, though its budget had been cut and its timeline shortened. But they would do what they could with the time and resources they had. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the plaza, more people began to arrive for the evening's ceremony. Family members of the disappeared, human rights activists, journalists, diplomats and ordinary citizens who had come to bear witness. Among them, Traoré spotted his father, Joseph Traoré, walking slowly toward the monument with the aid of a cane. The old man had aged visibly over the past year and a half. The strain of confronting memories he had buried for decades had taken its toll, but he had also found a measure of peace. After initial resistance, Joseph had finally shared his own story with the commission, how he had watched helplessly as his brother was arrested, how he had tried and failed to secure Musa's release through bribes and connections, how he had eventually been warned that continuing to ask questions would endanger his own young family. "I became a coward," Joseph had said during his testimony, his voice breaking. I chose my own survival, my own children's safety over my brother's life. I have lived with that shame every day for 37 years. But the commission members had been gentle with him, explaining what so many families needed to hear, that there was no shame in choosing survival, no dishonor in protecting one's children from a regime that had shown itself capable of destroying entire families. The shame belonged to those who had created the system of fear, not to those who had been forced to navigate it. Traoré approached his father now, embracing him carefully. "Thank you for coming, Papa." Joseph nodded, his eyes on the monument. I had to be here, to see his name, finally spoken aloud, finally acknowledged. All these years I felt like I was betraying him by not talking about him, but also betraying him by staying silent. It was an impossible situation. "You did what you had to do to protect your family," Traoré said firmly. "Uncle Musa would have understood. He said so in his letter. He told you to protect your family." "Perhaps," Joseph said softly, "but I wish he could have known his nephew. You are so much like him, Ibrahim, the same certainty that justice is worth fighting for, the same unwillingness to accept comfortable lies. Sometimes when I listen to you speak, I hear my brother's voice." They stood together in silence for a moment, 2 generations united by grief and love for a man who had been stolen from them both. Around them, the plaza filled with hundreds of people, all of them connected by loss, by absence, by the slowly healing wounds of historical trauma. The ceremony began as the sun touched the horizon. A local imam offered prayers, followed by a Catholic priest and a traditional spiritual leader, reflecting the religious diversity of those who had disappeared. Then came the testimonies, family members reading statements about their lost loved ones, sharing memories that had been suppressed for too long. A woman spoke about her father, a doctor who had been arrested for providing free medical care to rural villages as part of Sankara's health initiatives. A man described his sister, a student activist who had organized literacy programs for women and had vanished on her way home from university. An elderly teacher told of colleagues who had simply failed to show up for work one day and were never seen again. Each story was unique, but they formed a collective narrative of systematic repression, of a regime that had seen idealism and civic engagement as threats to be eliminated. The audience listened in rapt silence, many weeping openly, as the full scope of what had been done became clear. When it came time for Traoré to speak, he approached the microphone with his uncle's journals in hand. He had debated whether to bring them, whether to share such personal documents with the public, but in the end, he had decided that his uncle's words deserved to be heard, that they represented not just one man's experience, but the hopes and fears of an entire generation. "My uncle, Musa Traoré, was a teacher," he began, his voice carrying across the plaza. "He taught history and civics in our village of Bondokwi. He was 35 years old when he was arrested in December 1987. He died in detention in March 1988 from malnutrition and dysentery, denied medical care despite being gravely ill. He was buried in an unmarked grave. Until 18 months ago, my family did not even speak his name." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "I want to read you something my uncle wrote just weeks before his arrest. It comes from his journal, dated October 1987. Traoré opened the weathered notebook to a page he had marked. "I know my beliefs have made me a target. I know that in this new era, speaking truth is dangerous. But what is the alternative? To remain silent while injustice flourishes, to pretend I do not see what is happening to our country, to our revolution, to our dreams. I became a teacher because I believed in the power of knowledge to transform lives. If I abandon that belief now, when it is most tested, then I was never truly a teacher at all. Better to stand for something and face the consequences than to stand for nothing and live comfortably with my own cowardice." His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "My uncle chose principles over safety. He chose integrity over survival, and he paid the ultimate price for that choice. But his words, his beliefs, his commitment to justice, these could not be killed. They survived in hidden journals, in the memories of those who knew him, in the lessons he taught to students who never forgot their teacher." Traoré closed the journal and looked directly at the crowd. "This monument represents more than names on bronze plaques. It represents the truth that no amount of repression can permanently bury. It represents the resilience of the human spirit, the power of memory to resist erasure. Every person named here believed in something larger than themselves, whether it was education, healthcare, environmental protection, women's rights, or simply the basic dignity of all people. They were not perfect. The revolution they supported was not perfect, but they dared to imagine a better Burkina Faso, and they were punished for that imagination. He paused, gathering his thoughts for what he knew would be the most difficult part of his speech. As a military leader, as someone who now holds power in this country, I'm acutely aware of the responsibility that comes with that power. I am aware that the state apparatus I serve is the same apparatus that was used to oppress and disappear these people. That knowledge weighs on me every single day. But I also believe that we can choose to use that apparatus differently. We can choose transparency over secrecy, justice over impunity, truth over convenient lies. We can choose to honor the memory of the disappeared, not just with monuments, but with our actions, by building the kind of country they dreamed of, even if they did not live to see it. He raised his voice, infusing it with the passion he felt. Burkina Faso has spent too long haunted by silence, by fear of confronting our past. But we cannot move forward while looking backward, and we cannot move forward while pretending the past does not exist. We must look our history directly in the face, all of it, the beautiful and the terrible, and say, this happened. These were our people. They mattered, and we will not forget them. The crowd erupted in applause, but also in tears. Traoré saw people embracing, saw strangers offering comfort to one another, saw the collective catharsis of a nation finally permitted to grieve publicly for losses that had been forced into the shadows for too long. As the ceremony concluded and night fell over Ouagadougou, the monument was illuminated with soft lights that made the names glow against the darkness. People lined up to approach the plaques, to touch the names of their loved ones, to leave flowers and candles and small offerings. Traoré stood to the side, watching this procession of memory and mourning. He felt someone approach and turned to find Papa Adama, the old man from Bondoukoui who had started this entire journey with a simple letter. Adama had insisted on making the trip despite his failing health, and now he stood gazing at the monument with tears streaming down his weathered face. "You did well, my son," Adama said quietly. "Musa would be proud, not just of this monument, but of what it represents. The courage to seek truth, the strength to confront injustice, the wisdom to understand that reconciliation requires acknowledgement, not amnesia. I could not have done this without you," Traoré replied. "If you had not sent that letter, if you had not kept my uncle's house locked and waiting all these years, I was merely a custodian," Adama interrupted gently. "I kept the key, but you were the one brave enough to turn it and walk through that door. That took courage, the courage to risk discovering things about your family that might have been easier not to know." They stood together in companionable silence, two men separated by generations, but united by their commitment to honoring the dead and serving the truth. After a while, Adama squeezed Traoré's arm. "I am tired now. My daughter will take me home. But before I go, I want you to know something. I am old, and I will not live much longer, but I will die content, knowing that Musa's story has been told, that his life meant something, that he is remembered." "He will always be remembered," Traoré promised. "Jean, I will make sure of it." As Adama departed, Traoré found himself approached by a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, with the bearing and confidence of someone educated and engaged with the world. She introduced herself as Aminata, a graduate student studying history at the University of Ouagadougou. "Captain Traoré, I wanted to thank you for the work you have done with the commission," she said. "My grandmother's brother is on this monument. He was a journalist who wrote critically about the 1987 coup. His disappearance has been a shadow over our family my entire life. But now, because of this work, I am writing my thesis about the post-Sankara purges, about how historical memory is constructed and reconstructed, about the role of truth-telling in post-authoritarian societies." She gestured toward a group of young people standing near the monument, taking photographs, reading the names, discussing what they were seeing. "My generation did not live through these events, but we inherited their consequences. We grew up in a Burkina Faso shaped by this period of repression, by the silences it created, by the lessons it taught about the costs of speaking truth to power. What you have done here, giving us access to this history, refusing to let it remain buried, This is essential for us to understand who we are and what kind of country we want to build." Traoré felt a surge of hope hearing her words. This was precisely what his uncle had believed in. The power of education, of truth, of giving young people the tools to think critically about their society. Moussa Traoré had died believing in that power, and now, decades later, his nephew was helping to fulfill that belief. "Tell me," Traoré said to Aminata, "what do you think we should do next? The Commission has documented what happened. We have created this memorial. We have given families some measure of closure. But what comes after acknowledgement? How do we transform truth-telling into justice, memory into meaningful change?" Aminata considered the question carefully. "I think we need to integrate this history into our national curriculum. Every student in Burkina Faso should learn about this period, should understand how a regime can use fear to silence dissent, should recognize the warning signs of authoritarian consolidation. We need to make sure that the lessons of this era are not just preserved in academic papers and monuments, but in the consciousness of every new generation. We also need reforms," she continued, warming to her subject. "Reforms to ensure that security forces cannot be used for political repression, that detention facilities are subject to oversight and inspection, that families have legal recourse when their loved ones are arrested or disappeared. The structures that enabled these abuses still exist. They have been reformed to some degree, but they still exist. Without institutional change, we risk repeating these patterns." She paused, then added quietly, "And we need prosecutions, Captain. Not revenge, but accountability. Justice delayed is justice denied, and too many of those responsible for these crimes have lived comfortably with their guilt for decades. If we truly want to break the cycle, we need to demonstrate that power does not grant immunity, that orders from above do not absolve individuals of moral responsibility." Traoré nodded slowly. These were the same conclusions the Commission had reached, the same recommendations they had submitted to the government, but recommendations were easy. Implementation was the challenge. There were powerful interests opposed to further investigation, to prosecutions that might implicate individuals still holding positions of influence. "I will not promise you quick justice," he told Aminata honestly. "The political reality is complicated, but I promise you that I will continue to push for accountability, to advocate for the reforms you describe, to fight against the forces of amnesia and impunity. This monument is a beginning, not an ending. That is all we can ask," Aminata replied. "That those with power use it for justice rather than self-interest. Thank you, Captain, for being one of the good ones." As she rejoined her friends, Traoré reflected on her words. One of the good ones. It was a heavy burden being seen that way, being held to that standard. But it was also a responsibility he had willingly accepted when he began investigating his uncle's disappearance. He had opened a door that could not be closed, had started asking questions that demanded answers, had committed himself to a path that would not be easy but was necessary. The evening deepened into night, but the plaza remained crowded. People were reluctant to leave, as if physical proximity to the monument provided comfort, connection to the lost loved ones whose names were inscribed there. Musicians had begun to play traditional songs, and some people were dancing. Not frivolous celebration, but the kind of movement that expressed grief and resilience simultaneously, that honored the dead while affirming the continuity of life. Traoré saw his father sitting on a bench, staring at Moussa's name with an expression of profound sadness and relief intermingled. He went and sat beside him, and for a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Joseph said, "I used to dream about him, about Moussa. Every few months, I would have the same dream. He would knock on my door, looking just as he did the last time I saw him, and he would say, 'Brother, I have been away, but I am home now.' And I would wake up and remember that he was never coming home, and I would feel the loss all over again." "And now?" Traoré asked gently. "Now I have a different dream," Joseph replied. "I dream that I go to visit him, that I sit with him under a tree like when we were boys, and I tell him about my son, about the man you have become. And in the dream, he smiles and says he is proud. Not of me, I failed him, but of you. He would be so proud of you, Ibrahim." "You did not fail him, Papa," Traoré insisted. "You survived. You kept your family safe. You gave me life, raised me, taught me values that allowed me to do this work. Everything I am able to do to honor Uncle Musa's memory exists because you made the hard choices that ensured I would be born, would grow up, would have the opportunity to seek truth. That is not failure. That is the opposite of failure." Joseph turned to look at his son, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Now, when did you become so wise?" "I learned from my uncle's journals," Traoré replied with a small smile. "He wrote a lot about forgiveness, about understanding that people do what they must to survive, that moral judgments are easy for those who have not faced impossible choices. He would not judge you, Papa. He would thank you for protecting your family." They sat together as the night grew deeper, as the crowd gradually thinned, as the lights of Ouagadougou sparkled around them, father and son, connected by love and loss, by grief and gratitude, by the threads of family that had been broken, but not severed by time and tragedy. In the weeks and months that followed the monument's unveiling, Traoré continued his dual life as military leader and advocate for historical justice. The insurgency in the north demanded his attention and strategic thinking. Economic challenges required policy solutions. Political maneuvering within the government tested his patience and diplomatic skills, but through it all, he remained committed to the work the Commission had begun. Some progress was made. The national curriculum was revised to include a unit on the post-1987 period, with Musa's journals excerpted in textbooks as primary source material. A permanent archive was established at the National Museum, preserving the testimonies and documentation collected by the Commission. Several lower-level officials who had participated in the repression were prosecuted, though the most powerful figures remained beyond reach. But more importantly, the culture of silence had been broken. Families no longer feared speaking about their disappeared loved ones. Journalists wrote extensively about the period, interviewing survivors and witnesses. Artists created works inspired by the stories, plays, songs, paintings, films, that kept the memory alive in the national consciousness. Traoré himself became a symbol of the possibility of moral leadership, of using power for justice rather than personal enrichment. He received invitations to speak at universities, at international conferences on transitional justice, at gatherings of human rights organizations. He was asked to advise other African nations grappling with their own histories of political repression, but he never forgot where it had all started, with a letter from an old man, a blue door in a forgotten house, and journals filled with the thoughts of an idealistic teacher who had refused to compromise his principles. On the one-year anniversary of the monument's dedication, Traoré returned to Bondokui. He visited his uncle's house, which he had transformed into a small museum and educational center. The dusty, abandoned rooms had been cleaned and restored, the journals displayed behind protective glass, the photographs enlarged and hung on the walls. Local schoolchildren came for field trips, learning about their village's role in Burkina Faso's complex history. Papa Adama had passed away 6 months after the monument's unveiling, dying peacefully in his sleep as he had hoped. But his legacy lived on in the work he had made possible, in the truth he had refused to let die, in the letter that had changed everything. Traoré stood in the courtyard of the museum, looking at a photograph of his uncle surrounded by students, and felt a profound sense of connection across time and death. "I did it, Uncle," he whispered to the image. "I told your story. I broke the silence. I made sure you are remembered." A breeze rustled through the compound, warm and gentle, carrying with it the scent of dust and growing things. And in that moment, Traoré felt something like peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of having honored a debt, of having done what was right even when it was difficult, of having used his position and privilege to serve justice rather than power. As he left the museum and walked through Bondokui's streets, children recognized him and waved. Elders greeted him with respect and gratitude. And Traoré understood that this too was part of his uncle's legacy, the connection between truth-telling and community healing, between acknowledging the past and building the future. Burkina Faso still faced enormous challenges. The insurgency continued. Poverty remained widespread. Political stability was fragile. But the nation had taken an important step. It had chosen to confront rather than bury its history, to honor rather than forget those who had been disappeared, to demand accountability rather than accept impunity. And in that choice, in that collective act of remembrance and reckoning, there was hope. Hope that the sacrifices of Musa Traoré and all those like him had not been in vain. Hope that their beliefs in justice, equality, and human dignity would continue to inspire new generations. Hope that Burkina Faso could truly become what its name promised, a land of upright people, built on a foundation of truth rather than lies, of memory rather than amnesia, of justice rather than expedience. As Traoré drove back toward Ouagadougou that evening, the setting sun painting the Sahelian landscape in shades of gold and amber, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. It had started with curiosity about a family secret, but it had become something far larger, a national reckoning, a cultural transformation, a commitment to ensuring that the disappeared would never be forgotten, that their stories would be told, that their lives would be honored. His uncle's blue door was no longer locked, the house was no longer silent and abandoned, and the truth it had contained for so many years was now part of Burkina Faso's collective memory, woven into the national narrative, taught to children in schools, discussed in families, remembered in monuments and museums and hearts. This, Traoré understood, was what his uncle had meant when he wrote that ideas cannot be killed. Justice, dignity, equality, truth, these were not just abstract concepts. They were forces that persisted, that endured, that survived even the most determined efforts to suppress them. They were seeds that lay dormant for decades, but could still sprout when given the right conditions. They were voices that could be silenced but not eliminated, stories that could be hidden but not destroyed, memories that could be denied but not erased. Moussa Traoré had been killed for his beliefs, but his beliefs had outlived his killers. His voice, silenced for decades, now spoke to thousands through his journals, his letters, his example. His life, which the regime had tried to erase, was now enshrined in national memory, honored in monuments, studied in classrooms, invoked in speeches about courage and principle. And his nephew, who had never met him, who had not even known his name until a letter arrived one December morning, had become the instrument through which his uncle's legacy was preserved and amplified. As darkness fell and Ouagadougou's lights appeared on the horizon, Traoré thought about all the families who had received some measure of closure through the Commission's work, all the disappeared whose stories had finally been told, all the survivors who no longer had to carry their grief in silence. He thought about Aminata and her generation, who would inherit a Burkina Faso that had finally confronted its past honestly. He thought about his father, who could now speak his brother's name without fear, who had been released from the burden of decades of forced silence, and he thought about himself, a military officer who had become an advocate for historical justice, a son who had uncovered family secrets that reshaped his understanding of his heritage, a leader who had chosen to use his power for truth-telling rather than self-preservation. The road ahead was long. Justice was incomplete. Accountability remained elusive for many of the most responsible. The forces of amnesia and denial had not been vanquished, merely pushed back, but progress had been made. Ground had been gained. The conversation had been changed. And that, Traoré realized, was what his uncle's sacrifice had made possible. Not immediate revolution, not instant transformation, but the beginning of a process, slow, difficult, painful, but ultimately necessary, of national healing built on acknowledgement rather than denial, on memory rather than forgetting, on justice rather than impunity. As he entered Ouagadougou and navigated the evening traffic toward his office, where reports awaited and decisions needed to be made, Traoré carried with him the lessons he had learned from a man he never met, that principles matter, that courage is sometimes found in small acts of resistance, that speaking truth to power has a cost but also a value beyond measure, and that ideas, the right ideas, the just ideas, the humane ideas, cannot be permanently suppressed because they live not just in institutions and laws, but in human hearts and human hope. The blue door in Bondoukoui had been opened, the silence had been broken, the disappeared had been remembered, and Burkina Faso, slowly, painfully, courageously, was learning to face its history with honesty, to honor its dead with truth, and to build its future on a foundation of justice rather than convenient lies. This was Moussa Traoré's legacy. This was Ibrahim Traoré's mission. This was the work of a generation determined to ensure that never again would voices of conscience be silenced, that never again would the disappeared be forgotten, that never again would fear triumph over truth. The monument stood in the heart of Ouagadougou, its bronze plaques gleaming under artificial lights, bearing witness to suffering and resilience, to loss and remembrance, to silence broken and voices restored. And every evening, as darkness fell, people would gather there to read the names, to remember the dead, to draw inspiration from those who had stood for justice when justice was dangerous, to recommit themselves to building the kind of country those disappeared persons had dreamed of but did not live to see. Among those names, Moussa Traoré would endure, teacher, idealist, martyr for truth, uncle to a nephew who ensured his story would never be forgotten. His life had been cut short by political violence, but his legacy would stretch across generations, inspiring all those who believed that a better world was possible, that justice was worth pursuing, that truth, however painful, was always preferable to comfortable lies. This was the gift Ibrahim Traoré had given his uncle, not just a name on a monument, but a place in the nation's memory, a role in its ongoing struggle for justice, a voice that would continue to speak across time about courage, principle, and the enduring power of ideas that refuse to die. And this, in turn, was the gift Moussa Traoré had given his nephew and his nation, the example of a life lived with integrity, the inspiration of beliefs maintained in the face of persecution, the proof that one person's courage, however modest their position, can make a difference that echoes across decades. As Traoré finally reached his office and prepared to return to the urgent matters of governance and security, he paused to look back toward where the monument stood in the darkness, invisible from this distance, but present nonetheless, a permanent fixture in the landscape of national memory. "Thank you, Uncle," he whispered to the night. "Thank you for showing me what courage looks like. Thank you for refusing to be silent. Thank you for believing, even when belief was dangerous. Your story has been told, your life has been honored. Your sacrifice has not been forgotten." And somewhere in whatever realm the dead inhabit, Moussa Traoré's spirit could finally rest, knowing that his voice had been heard, his story told, his beliefs vindicated not through his own efforts, but through the work of a nephew who had inherited his courage, his principles, and his unshakable commitment to truth and justice. The blue door was open, the silence was broken. The disappeared were remembered, and Burkina Faso, slowly but surely, was learning to face its past with honesty and its future with hope. This was not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of a new chapter in which truth would triumph over denial, justice over impunity, memory over amnesia. It was the chapter Moussa Traoré had dreamed of but never lived to see. It was the chapter Ibrahim Traoré was writing, word by word, decision by decision, truth by truth, and it was a chapter that would continue long after both men were gone, written by generations yet unborn, inspired by the courage of those who refused to remain silent, guided by the examples of those who chose principle over safety, justice over comfort, truth over convenient lies. The land of upright people was still becoming what its name promised. But with each story told, each truth acknowledged, each memory honored, it came one step closer to fulfilling that promise, a nation built not on the suppression of its history, but on the courage to face it, not on the silencing of inconvenient voices, but on the wisdom to listen to them, not on the erasure of uncomfortable truths, but on the strength to preserve and learn from them. This was Moussa Traoré's legacy, Ibrahim Traoré's mission, and Burkina Faso's ongoing journey from silence to speech, from amnesia to memory, from fear to courage, from injustice to accountability, from a painful past to a hopeful future built on the foundation of truth. The Ndeundi total word count, approximately 10,500 words, approximately 65,000 characters. This epilogue brings the story to a powerful conclusion, showing the long-term impact of Traoré's investigation into his uncle's disappearance, the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the creation of a national monument, and the broader cultural shift toward confronting Burkina Faso's difficult history. It maintains emotional depth, while providing a realistic and hopeful vision of how societies can begin to heal from periods of political repression and violence.